Good evening and welcome to tonight's event. I think it's dealing with a process, a phenomenon that is both timely and critical and important, that had received very little attention until very recently, although I'm told by Diana that there is an event like this today at Princeton University and also at Georgetown, you told me. So apparently it's being increasingly recognized as what it is, right? The biggest migration anywhere in the world taking place today, and also the most important humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere. My name is Jose Moya. I'm the director of the Forum on Migration at Barnard College and also of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University, two of the institutions or entities that have sponsored this event. And I wanted to also thank the other co-sponsors of this event, the student group Columbia for Colombia, specifically Alejandro Samper and Elena Navarrete right there that have been instrumental in organizing this and in helping along. And the NGO, Venezuelan NGO, Acción por la Libertad, and again, particularly its director and its founder, Diana López, who's also one of the panelists, and will begin our program soon. Also, of course, I would like to thank the other panelists. David Smolansky is the former mayor of El Hatillo municipality in Caracas, and now the coordinator of a working group on Venezuela's migratory crisis that is part of the Organization of American States. Mónica Pachón on my extreme right, and that's not her political position or ideological position, it's just a coincidence. Is a professor of political science at the Universidad del Rosario, the University of Rosario in Bogota, Colombia. I'm presently a Tinker visiting professor at Columbia University. We're very happy to have her here in general and here in this panel. And Patrick Gage, Director of Development of the Scalabrini International Migration Network, who has spoken about human trafficking at many places, including the White House, the US Capitol, the UN, and even the Vatican. So many different and important places, I guess. I think the subject of tonight's panel is both important, is both tragic, and it's also puzzling. Venezuela was, until very recently, one of the richest countries in Latin America. Per capita income was the highest in Latin America in the post-World War II decades, right? It was also a country that was a receiver, a major receiver of immigrants. Millions of immigrants from Europe and Latin America went there looking for a better life, for opportunities, for high wages. And today, it has a collapsed economy. The economy has shrunk in 5 years by 35%. I don't remember any similar case in recent memory, particularly when it's not related to war or destructions or genocide and things like that. The inflation rate apparently may reach 1 million. I mean, it's the highest by far in the world. And there is an exodus. People are fleeing rather than going there. Over 3 million people have fled Venezuela in the last years. This is, again, unprecedented. There are cases of countries that have been senders of immigrants, most Western European countries, and are today receivers of immigrants. But I don't know many that were receivers of immigrants and became expellers of immigrants in such a drastic and sharp and fast way, particularly because unlike other cases of refugees exodus, like, I don't know, Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq before, right? Or Sudan, where there were civil wars, there is no civil war here or international war. So it is, what is happening? How could you explain this anomaly? And I think part of the panel today is try to address that, why this happened, why it is happening now, who's leaving, where are they going, what is being done to help them, and how is it affecting receiving countries. Colombia alone has received over 1 million refugees in the last few years. This is more than all of the refugees that Germany received in 2015, 2016, right? And Colombia is a much poorer country with fewer resources. So the challenges to these countries, not only Colombia, but Peru also has 500,000 Venezuelans, Panama. It's something that, you know, we would like to explore. So Diana is going to begin with an exhibition of photographs taken by artists and activists about what is going on. That is, I saw them, they're visual, and they grasp that old saying that an image is worth 1,000 words. I don't know about that, but they're grabbing and they really show what is going on. So thank you for coming. And let's welcome all of them.
Hello, my name is Diana López. I'm Venezuelan, and as Jose said, I represent Acción por la Libertad. I first want to thank Columbia University, Barnard College, ILAS, and Jose Moya for putting up this panel. It's quite a coincidence that today there's a similar panel in Washington, D.C., in Georgetown University, where part of the panel is Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, and other professors from the university. And at a similar time in Princeton University, a similar panel is discussing the Venezuelan migration crisis at the same time. So at least we're thankful to the academic institutions in the US to be putting the time and the thought that is deserved to this urgent, very urgent crisis that can only be compared at this time to the Syrian immigration crisis. Action for Libertad was started in 2014 as a result of the repression that the government of Maduro, the violent repression, did against the protesters that were on the streets, on several streets in Venezuela, and that resulted in assassinations, in detentions, arbitrary detentions, imprisonments, and later in exiles. So a group of citizens, mostly artists and journalists, we got together and we thought that our duty was to put images and thought, maybe art, poetry, and photography to the crisis that was going on in Venezuela. In 2014, we started working with the families of political prisoners, and we did several works about the repression in Venezuela. But lately, we understood that our work had to broaden itself and had to include the crisis, the migration crisis, partly because part of our team had to go on exile. And part of the work that I'm going to show is Venezuelan friends that have had to go through the border walking to Colombia. So it's a very close to us what we're going to show. Sorry, the presentation is called Solidarities Among and with Los Caminantes. Los Caminantes means the walkers. And I think the walkers are not just the people who are walking right now, but it started before, those people who had to leave the country from the air, because the migration has been by plane, by bus, by car, by boats, and now by feet. So among what I'm going to show are photographers and artists who have shown their solidarity to these people that have had no other way of surviving but to leave their country. These are going to be, what I'm going to show are symbols of this migration crisis. Some are the views of the airport, the International Airport Simón Bolívar. Some are views of the bridge, the Simón Bolívar bridge that communicates the city of San Antonio and the city of Cúcuta, a small bridge that is 300 meters long, but that have been the scenery to the most enormous migration that has Latin America ever seen. And the other ones are, as I said, the walkers, those millions of people that are walking through South America every day. The first work I'm going to show is from Cristóbal Ochoa. This is a view of the International Airport Simón Bolívar in Caracas, in Maiquetía. And this airport in the 70s got an impressive, beautiful artwork made by Carlos Cruz Diez. And as you can see in this image, it's a mural, but it's on the floor, and it's very colorful, and it used to be a celebration for us to receive people when they were arriving from other places or to say goodbye. But the goodbyes were usually short goodbyes. They were not sad goodbyes. Now, as can be shown there, they are sad goodbyes. The first people who were leaving the country, it started maybe 2010, 2012. There were young people, students, or young professionals looking for opportunities in other countries. It could be the United States, Canada, Europe, even Asia, or the Middle East, or South America. But they were all, let's say, legal immigrants. These are some selfies from these people who were leaving and who still have had to leave their country. They are selfies of their shoes on top of this artwork by Cruz Diez. The artist Cristóbal Ochoa, in 2015, on his Facebook, he asked people to send him those selfies, and he collected them all, and he showed them at a gallery where, in El Hatillo, where David Smolansky used to be the mayor at that time, in 2015. We never thought at that time that later, the same David Smolansky, the mayor of that municipality, would have to go in exile. Now the artist also, Cristóbal Ochoa, has also had to flee the country and is in Paris because of his participation in the protest. In 2017, he also had to leave the country. Another way to leave Venezuela is by bus. Here is a map of a bus trip of a couple, Alex and Nia, that they had to go from Caracas to Lima, more than 4,000 kilometers in 1 week. The photographer Gabriel Mendez decided, as a solidarity, and with the support of a website, Pro Da Vinci, a web newsletter, Pro Da Vinci, they took the trip together. Alex and Nia, a couple that had been together 2 years, decided to leave their families, their friends, their one-thought future, and go to Lima. They only had $900, 5 suitcases, and 4,452 kilometers to travel. This is an image of them crossing from San Antonio to Cúcuta. And then, well, many, many, many long hours on the bus and 4 countries. They went from Venezuela to Colombia to Ecuador and finally to Peru. They arrived and their brother, Alex's younger brother, received them at his small room in Lima. His younger brother had to leave because he was also part of the protest in 2014, and he had to leave his country. The first thing that Nia did when she got her first job was buy a pair of shoes. You can find more about this story in Pro Da Vinci. Again, the images of the bridge between San Antonio and Cúcuta. Some people go by bus, but others have no option because they don't even have $900. They only have maybe $20, $10, and they only can go with the solidarity of the people that they found along the route, the trail. These are some of them, los caminantes. The journalist Adriana Abramovich went to Cúcuta and walked to the Páramo del Berlín. And she found these groups of people. Some of them are families. Some of them, they found themselves and become family among the route, the trial. As you can see, they're no longer just young men. Now, even young children are leaving the country. Another group of two women, Patricia Castellanos and Marisabel León, with the support of Acción por la Libertad, decided to also go and be witness of what is happening between Cúcuta and Bogota. And they found this shelter. This is a shelter of a small stand of this lady called Marta. Marta sells coffee and food on this small place, but she also gives shelter to the refugees, to the migrants. And each person that walks by, they leave a note. And you can see the notes here and where they're coming from. They're coming from Guárico, from Barquisimeto. And one thing that you can see in these photographs is that you can see bills, Venezuelan bills, and they're writing their notes on the Venezuelan bills. And why are they doing that? Because those bills are worthless. The money in Venezuela is not worth anything due to inflation. So those bills could be thrown away to the trash, or they can be used as they use them to give messages to the ones that are coming after. They're messages to give hope to the other ones. This is Nancy. She's Colombian, and she was able, with some help, to put up this roof, and on that roof, many people stay and spend the night. She also put up a bathroom for the women, and she also cooks every day some soup for the ones that need something to eat. The ones that I have mentioned so far are usually legal immigrants, but there are others that don't even have a passport. So they don't have money, they don't have jobs, they don't have any options, and they don't even have an identity. But they also want to leave. And when they do it in the most dangerous ways. And one of the ways is the ones that we're seeing in these images. Ipanisa is an independent photographer who did go to Cúcuta from Caracas and then did a trail, but the trail, Caminos Verdes, as we call it, not the legal trails, but the other trails. And in those trochas, as we also call them, these are the scenes that he captured. The man on this image has not been found. That's on the west of our country. But in the south, where the Amazon jungle is, there's also been people who have decided to walk away from the crisis in Venezuela. They go in that area that is called Santa Elena de Guairén from the state of Bolívar, and they walk, sometimes in dangerous trails, sometimes in legal ways, but they go to Pacaraima, and they arrive to Boa Vista, which is the capital of the state of Roraima in Brazil. In that city, Boa Vista, there's a shelter by a group of Jesuitas. It's called Servicio Jesuita a Migrantes y Refugiados. There, a Brazilian woman who is dedicated to geography was very concerned of what she was seeing, and she's not a professional photographer, but she decided to photograph each person that was going through that service. She photographed between March and June of this year, 5,000 people. These are some of them. Well, as I said, there are people who are living by plane, others by bus, others by feet, by their own means, others by boat. Right now is a time for solidarity. It's a time for solidarity from other governments, from all the governments in the region. It's a time for solidarity for the OAS, for the United Nations, for the church, which has been very active, and probably David, who will explain because he's been there personally in those two places, for the universities, for the ONGs, for the foundations, and for the individuals. Each of us can do something to help this crisis. Thank you very much.
I guess, I mean, the first obvious question is, how could this happen? I mean, what happened in Venezuela? This is exceptional. Countries do not implode, and particularly if it is countries that are not at war or, Holocaust or, I mean, anyone has any thought, David?
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Moya and Imas and Columbia University for inviting us. It's a real pleasure to be in this panel. And I think this question to start this conversation, as you suggested, is the key to understand what's going on in Venezuela. Venezuela, as we speak, has had 3 million people that had fled the country since 2014. That's right now the second largest refugee population in the world, just behind Syria. There are more Venezuelan refugees than Somalia, Afghanistan, South Sudan, or Myanmar. It's the biggest migration and refugee crisis that Latin America has ever seen, and as we speak, is the largest at the Western Hemisphere. 5,000 Venezuelans are fleeing the country daily, which is the same to say that 208 Venezuelans flee the country every hour. So by the time we finish this conference, more than 400 Venezuelans would have fled my country. Why is this happening? Well, what is incredible is that it has happened with no war and with no natural catastrophe. Syria has a bit more than 6 million refugees, and it has happened in 70 years and with a war. But there are many causes of this. The first is the humanitarian crisis. There is a lack of food, lack of medicine. More than 60% of the Venezuelans cannot eat or cannot have 3 meals a day. So 1.2 million out of 3 million that have fled the country are suffering from malnutrition. The majority are kids, are teenagers. Second, on this humanitarian crisis, there is lack of medicine. So if you are having, there are diseases that were disappeared, that were eradicated, and now are having it again, like diphtheria, malaria, tuberculosis. So there are so many people, thousands of people fleeing with these diseases. I just went to the border last week, and for example, in Maicao is a city in Colombia, border on the northern of Venezuela, people with HIV positive have increased 375%. That's what we were told by the local authorities. 70% of the women that give birth in that city are Venezuelans. And if you go to another cities in other part of the border, like in Cucuta, between 30 and 40% of the women that are giving birth are Venezuelan. So you don't have the opportunity to give birth in Venezuela. Your baby is in danger. If you are sick, it's difficult to get attended in a hospital in Venezuela, so just people decide to flee. Then you have the economic collapse. The IMF has said that this year, hyperinflation in Venezuela will be close on 1 million%, and it's projected on 10 million% of 2019. And it could sound crazy, but those are the numbers set by the IMF. 1 million% for 2018, that will be a bit more, and 10 million% is projected in 2018. So it doesn't matter how much you work in Venezuela. Money will never be enough. Third, there are human rights violations. There are more than 400 political prisoners. A lot of those political prisoners have been tortured, have been isolated. There are hundreds who are in exile, and thousands of Venezuelans that especially participated in protests last year that felt threatened, that felt persecuted, and they have decided to flee. So when you have this economic collapse, when you have this human rights violation, when you have this humanitarian crisis, almost the only option that Venezuelans have to survive is to flee the country. But it's incredible that we're having now stats that are similar to a country that has suffered a war. In 5 years, the Venezuelan economy has shrunk almost 50%, which is something similar. It is even more than el periodo especial in Cuba. It is compared to Somalia or Eritrea or Liberia that has suffered from civil wars. And that combination of 50% of the shrink of the economy with a decrease of 80% of the imports, and Venezuela used to produce more than 3 million barrels, oil barrels, and now is producing a bit more than 1 million, even though Venezuela has the biggest proven oil reserve in the world. So this is a collapse, a man-made collapse. The reason here is the regime that is in Venezuela, the dictatorship that is in Venezuela, that has been in power for 20 years, that has become, Venezuela has become a safe haven for illicit activities, for irregular groups, and Venezuelans are completely unprotected. This is something unique, and it needs, and that's why we're trying to work from the OES, it needs a regional response. This is not something individual. This is not a problem of Colombia. It's not a problem of Brazil. It's not a problem of Peru. It needs a regional response. And in my opinion, the best solution for this migration and refugee crisis is to restore democracy in Venezuela. Is that our fellow Venezuelans recover their freedom. If you restore democracy in Venezuela, I'm sure that the exodus will stop, or at least will decrease. A lot of Venezuelans that maybe are there's a lot of some here will have the incentive to go back to a country to reunite with their family. But as long Maduro and the regime stays, the more people are going to flee. So sorry if I talk a little.
No. I mean, but what you say is obviously true, but still the question is, how did it get to that point, right? What level of misgovernance or stupidity or ill will, I mean, to get to that point? This is where we are today, but how? Maybe the political scientists have some wisdom about this.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm far from an expert, and I express my solidarity to you guys and to all Venezuelans. It's a very difficult situation that really cannot be explained by only an economic crisis. Colombia had a very important civil war and a civil conflict that displaced internally many people. But there was, in Colombia, an arrangement in a way that power is fragmented, where the state and the economy were separated. Venezuela, because of being an oil country and because of the government taking over PDVSA, I think had the largest impact on the economy, destroying the economy. This is a punto fijo sort of agreement. You do not destroy PDVSA. But here, there was an explicit capture of PDVSA, which made very difficult.
That's the Venezuelan National Oil Company. Yeah.
Yes, PDVSA is the national. And the other thing that it is interesting, and it has to do also with Colombia, It's that Venezuela and Colombia share this big frontier where illegal groups and drug traffic occurs. If you read Inside Crime and the recent reports they have written on the topic, you might notice that Venezuela frontier with Colombia is not only passing through people, but all kinds of drugs and illegal arms are passing daily through the frontier. Colombia has been a bad neighbor for a long time. Colombians were the unwanted of the region for a long time. Why? Because we migrated outside. We have a history of migrating to Venezuela. A lot of Colombians migrated to Venezuela in the 70s and 80s, precisely because of the economy and the advantages of a very subsidized economic system. However, when we get to the point where we have a kleptocracy or a government that is completely corrupted, what we find is a government that will control corruption, will engage in negotiations. This is not bribes from lower down military officers. This is called the cartel de los soles. These are generals. This is people who are in charge of security, enforcement, police, that are completely captured by this money, that are being prosecuted internationally for drug traffic, and that are actual drug traffickers in the international scene. So what we see is that Venezuela, having this situation because of Colombia's, neighboring Colombia, Colombia produces 85% of the cocaine that is consumed in the Americas. The problem for Venezuela is in an economic crisis, in a situation in which the public enforcement is not fighting against drug traffic, is not fighting against crime, but actually promoting it. Venezuela is the perfect place for the ELN to produce cocaine and do several activities that are not being done in the Colombian territory. So we see the Región de Catatumbo, which is the frontier with the Norte del Santander and Venezuela, where all sorts of things are happening. Our indicators are really bad there in terms of murder rates and homicide rates. So in a way, what we see is that this neighboring for Venezuela, if you have an economic crisis and you have bad management of the economy, that's one thing. But when the government decides to engage in criminal activity and have the possibility of becoming the route for drug traffic, it is another game altogether. And this is the game that in Colombia has been very difficult to fight. Colombia is fighting against drug traffic since the 1980s with lots of problems. But right now, and since 2015, Colombia, it's going to change the policy, but gave up fighting with coca production. Colombia said, peace process agreement, we're not going to go for aerial fumigation. We doubled the size of coca cultivation in Colombia in 2 years. Catatumbo being a very important region. We had a process of a peace process with the ELN that is no longer happening with this government. ELN is present in Venezuelan territory.
That's a guerrilla group.
A guerrilla, yeah, Ejército de Liberación Nacional. It's present all over Venezuela. And Venezuela has not been able to control these groups. So we have a number, and this, I think, a fragmentation of enforcement, of enforcement that make people just be without any protection of the government. So adding to all this humanitarian crisis of public services provision, of health, of economic downturns and busts of the commodities, we have a situation in which no longer citizens of Venezuela are safe in their own territory because these government officials and the militaries are not in charge of security, but rather the complete opposite.
But it seems also that, I mean, Venezuela is having the worst of both worlds, so to speak. I mean, if you look at Cuba, right? Cuba was an oppressive regime, authoritarian. Probably the dictatorship was even more totalitarian than that of Venezuela. There was no civil rights and liberties. But there was one security, stability, and so there was a plus side, if you will, right? Venezuela is something puzzling, that it has a repressive, authoritarian regime, and the highest levels of homicide and insecurity and crime. Usually these two things do not go together, right? One of the few advantages, if you will, of dictatorships is that they impose order. So you have lack of freedom and insecurity. And that's not too common, no?
Well, no, it's not common, but I think Professor Mónica explained it really well. I mean, Venezuela, the territory of Venezuela has become a safe haven for illicit activities.
Yeah, but I'm talking about street crime, not drug.
I'm going to there, and it has become a safe haven for criminal organizations, and it has become a safe haven for the criminal economy. So Maduro, at the end of the day, next year will be producing 1 million oil barrels per day, which will be the same as what we produced 60 years ago, approximately. But he doesn't give a damn, because with the criminal economy, through drug trafficking or illegal mining, he will get more money than producing oil. And yes, Caracas is the most dangerous capital to live in the world, according to the Gallup Group. Also, Venezuela has become the most dangerous country to live, according to this same group. The homicide rate in Venezuela is more than 70 per 100,000 people. Yeah. And that's because you have a government that for 20 years, insecurity has become like a state policy. So you have more than 90% of impunity, and people felt unprotected. I felt as a mayor, that was my biggest challenge. When I started as a mayor, my municipality has the highest kidnapping rate in Venezuela, one of the highest in Latin America. We were able to decrease by 80%. But I cannot explain it to you how frustrated it was when our local police detained anyone who was involved in a crime or something, and in 2 or 3 days he was already released. And we're talking people that was involved in murder, in kidnapping, or anything, extortion, and there was impunity. I'm just going to add something about how do we get there. I think also the Venezuelan situation, it's something that we need to learn, that this is also, it has gone beyond a dictatorship, I have to say. It's now a criminal state, a mafia state. But I think what we have to learn is that Venezuela is one of the examples of the modern dictatorship. In the past, you saw so many dictatorships, especially in Latin America, soldiers with tanks, with weapons, taking power, and we're here. How Chavez got to power in 1998? With a populist speech. He said that he's going to tackle corruption. You have legal political parties. Anyone who wanted to run for president was allowed to. You have independent media. Venezuela had rule of law, had alternative in power, and he used the democratic ways, the democratic institution, to conquer power. And from power, he destroyed those democratic institutions, and those are the modern dictatorship. So you don't need sometimes anymore a tank or something to be a dictatorship, because you can use the democratic ways to conquer power, and from power destroy that. So what we had this year, we had an election that was completely a fraud, was not free, was not fair. The main candidates of the opposition are in jail or in exile. The political parties have been illegalized. The media has been shut down or censorship. People are fleeing. The institutions are controlled. So how things change in just 20 years. 20 years for a country is nothing, but for a human being, it's a lot. When I was 13 years old when Chavez went to power. I was just starting in high school. Now I am 33, former mayor, in exile, and still we have this revolution. So as I said at the beginning, we need a regional response, not only to protect and attend the Venezuelan migrants and refugees, because we're going to need them to rebuild the country, but also we need a stronger regional response to restore democracy in Venezuela, because the problem in Venezuela is not only affecting Venezuelans, but also is affecting Latin Americans.
I think one of the things that is very interesting is the paradoxical situation in Venezuela regarding democratic consolidation. Venezuela and Colombia and Costa Rica were the democracies in the region. Since 1958, we were able to have elections, periodic elections, parties. ADE and COPEI, were parties that had a lot of problems. It was a corporatist regime. PDVSA, Fede Cámaras, the presidency were the source of power. We have Congress, but reality, what is going on is that we have a petrostate in which basically the government has control over 70% of the GDP. This is very different from an economy that has private sources of power, economic power. I do think that the situation of the coup for Chavez became an important turning point, because the coup was generated from within the military. So what he did was to devolve power to people, including arming people, arming the population to defend the regime. And I do think that that is a completely different story from a democracy, or a completely story from an authoritarian regime that is regular. Because when an authoritarian regime comes about, the authoritarian regime unarms the society and doesn't allow opposition to exist, and doesn't arm the society. Because the military is the force that is holding together the regime. If your military does the military coup, or part of it, you have to clean the military, but also empower other alternative forces to stay in power. And this militarization of society has enormous consequences. Paramilitary groups, colectivos, control of jails, that are completely crazy and become this fragmented source of power where Maduro or any government has to negotiate with these armed groups and illegal groups. Plus, you have this control of prices that is crazy. So selling gas across the frontier is better business than cocaine. Yes. Selling anything, basically, is better business than drugs at this point in Venezuela because of the crazy exchange rates. And there's no other way to adjetivizar this behavior. So when you have that type of situation in which all members of society are part of a black market and are benefiting from that, and they don't pay anything, well, how are you going to take that power away from them and that rent away from them?
I mean, that may explain this paradox of, that those high crime rates, because militarizing society, at the beginning, maybe the state can control it, but eventually these people, some sectors at least, will become independent and go into the business of crime. Which, well, either or kidnap groups or mafias or. Turning to what is happening and what is being done, I would like Patrick to tell us a little about what your specific institution is doing.
Yeah, sure. So I try to stay out of the politics as much as possible because that's not the business that we're in. We're in the business of feeding people, giving them beds to sleep in, giving them the vaccinations that they need, making sure they can talk to psychologists, these kinds of things. SIM, S-I-M-N, is a Catholic relief organization with a focus in Latin America, working with refugees and migrants. We have had a presence in the region for over 100 years, and we just, I mean, the way I say it is we pretty much just landed in the lap of this crisis. There were, in the past, other migration crises that put us in the correct cities. So in Cúcuta, for example, we've run programs for over 40 years. First working with Colombians who were actually migrating to Venezuela, and Colombians who had been deported from Venezuela for migrating illegally. Now, of course, in the last 4 or 5 years, the opposite is true. So we're serving only Venezuelans. And taking Cúcuta as an example, we're able to sleep about 120 people a night in the migrant shelter that we have. We serve around 1,500 meals a day, and working with a good mix of men, women, and children. So some families, some single men, some single women. And we run these kinds of migrant shelters throughout Colombia and other countries, all the way down the spine of South America, from Cúcuta to Bogota, Ipiales in the south, and then into Peru, Lima, Santiago, border communities in those countries as well. And again, the goal is to meet people's needs, whatever those needs are. I think in terms of reflecting on the crisis, what we're doing, what we can do, what we can't do, the international response has been subpar, to say the least. Embarrassing to go further. We and the other kind of grassroots organizations that we work with in Cúcuta and in other cities are desperate for resources and have been asking for resources for years from the UN, other larger international organizations, and have gotten very minimal support. UNHCR, for example, they're unfortunately, because for political reasons, they have not defined, and I don't think will define this as a refugee crisis, so their mandate doesn't technically extend to Venezuelans, which means that all of the things that you see them doing for Syrian refugees, they can't really do that for Venezuelans because it's technically under the purview of a different UN organization called IOM, the International Organization for Migration, which is also, again, I mean, UNHCR, IOM, other UN organizations, they're doing a little bit here and there, and I don't want to kind of cast any shade on them, but there's a lot more that they could be doing, and unfortunately, up to this point, that the kind of regional responses that David has been talking about and other panelists have been talking about just haven't happened, which means that organizations like mine, which are feeding people every day on the ground, you know, in buildings that were built to serve 100 people a day that are now supposed to be serving thousands a day, we can only do so much, you know, and so I think we're just one kind of cog in the machine, but I think that the machine in terms of relief for migrants and refugees from Venezuela has to be a lot bigger than it is right now. We're not going to go anywhere.
And the other thing that I was wondering about is the receiving countries, right? If you look at a graph of where in the world there is strongest anti-immigrant feelings, you find Lebanon, Jordan, Iran, places that have received millions of refugees, right? Latin American countries have a tradition of welcoming exiles, of generosity, of solidarity. But this is a big challenge, and it seems that it will become, if anything, a bigger challenge, right? On the resources of a country. And so the question will be how long the welcome can last. And where could they get? I mean, because in some cases it's just that they don't have the resources to deal with it, right? Unless it is some international entity, I don't see how sustainable this is for Colombia, right?
I don't think you can stop it. I think it is a reality that the country has to face. It's more than 35,000 people a day. You cannot stop it. And if you close, as the Colombian government did in February, made some decisions regarding migration, well, what is going to happen is that they are going to enter any other place, and you are going to feed bad people with limiting the
access.
sorry?
Access.
The access. Why? Because as in Venezuela, right now, there's a lot of people that do not have IDs, do not have passwords, do not have, and there are some civil servants taking advantage of that. So what they do is to create mafias, basically, to allow people to charge them much more for the ID than they would have to pay, maybe 200 times or 300 times. So any time that there's a need that is so intense as there is today, the Colombian government requires to be mature in what sense? Understanding that if it does something to stop it, it will feed it will feed the wrong people, and it will corrupt its bureaucracy. So what the government of Colombia is doing basically is trying to push for greater capacity at the frontier. There are several departments that are receiving more and less problems, right? The health issue is very important. There are potential crises that can be overcome with vaccination, and so the Colombian government is trying to do that. There is a problem of labor market, basically. Informality is rampant in Colombia. We are talking about an economy that is 50% informal. That means that people are willing to work for less of the minimum wage, of course, right? Minimum wage is not bad, but it is too high. And this is something that maybe you will kill me for, but it is too high compared to the median of the wage, average wage in Colombia. That means that it's not a social policy. It's a policy that protects people who earn too much money compared to the median, right? So what happens in that situation is that you have the incentives to informalize the economy. If you think about Venezuelans, and you think about the exchange rate of dollars, right? If I pay half of the minimum wage to a Venezuelan, it becomes, I don't know, $300, $250, which is an amount of money that is immense for remittances or to send to the family, back to the family. So I think the largest difficulty for Colombia is going to be to accept, to create the labor market necessary to formalize these people. Why? Because the incentive for Colombian enterprises and just business to abuse people and pay them 1/3 of the minimum wage is huge, right? I mean, I'm going to pay you $70, please, please pay me $70 a month. Margarita López Maya, who's a well-known university professor in Universidad Simón Bolívar, was telling us back in Bogota that professors are earning $3 or $4 a month because of inflation. So they come to class and they faint because they haven't eaten. More than 1,200 professors had fled the country and had left academia altogether. This is a market that is very small. This is a market that is high-end human resource. This market doesn't even survive this crisis. So what I'm trying to suggest is, I think the most difficult situation is labor market. But The other, the Colombian government, I think, can fulfill the capacity. If we can pay so much corruption, I'm sure we can do the vaccination thing. And, schools, schools do their job. It's not easy. There's a problem with IDs and documentation that I think it is very, very important for Venezuelans to formalize their situation in Colombia. There's lots of kids that do not have nationality right now. So those are problems that I think can be relatively solved. I would say the labor market is a little bit of a problem that is not easy because Colombia is not such a competitive economy.
Yeah, I mean, but that will also create a lot of resentment among the local populations, this, blaming Venezuelans for working for less and cheapening wages and taking jobs away from Colombians. This rhetoric is very common, and it has taken, so that's what I'm also afraid that the emergence of xenophobia as a rhetorical tool to get political power, right? This has worked quite well in places where there are not that many immigrants, like Hungary, Viktor Orban, right? That came to power just promoting the United States to a degree, right? So it seems that there are evidence in Chile, in Peru also, that this Venezuelan crisis, some demagogues are using it to promote their own political interests, and that will be a new thing in Latin America, and actually very sad.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, look, while I agree that you can't stop the flow of people and that receiving communities will inevitably have to continue receiving people, you can't create money out of nothing. Ecuador is a great example. They've blown a $500 or $600 million hole in their budget for Venezuelans. That's what they estimate they need, and they don't have the money to do that. Colombia is in the billions, the tens of billions of dollars. So I mean, being maybe slightly a natural pessimist, I do think that there is a reasonable situation that we see Colombia, Brazil, other countries close their borders officially. Of course, technically, that's not going to happen, as in the U.S. I mean, people migrate undocumented, and they will continue to do that. And I'm certainly not saying that's the response they should have. That's not a response I or my organization would advocate for. But to answer your question, with both the lack of resources and a rise of xenophobia that is in large part due to a weak economy on the border, where people were already struggling in Cucuta. It's not, they don't have set up industry. And frankly, in Cucuta, for example, a lot of the economy was based on trade with Venezuela, which doesn't really exist anymore except for illegal goods, gasoline, arms, drugs, and things like that. So I think the combination of those two things, a severe lack of resources, resources that, we can talk all day about kind of what needs to happen, but the money has to come from somewhere. Colombia does not have that money. Ecuador doesn't have the money. Peru doesn't have the money. Chile doesn't have the money. Brazil doesn't have the money. So I don't know where that's going to come from, but that's one key problem. The second is exactly what you said, is there's a rise of xenophobia and people who maybe didn't have a job, and then all of a sudden they see a Venezuelan come in, and that person finds a job because my organization helps them find one, and they're like, why aren't you helping us too? And we do that. We help both populations, but we're only one small player in a crowd of millions of people. So I think that's a legitimate fear. That Bolsonaro, the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, even Duque. I mean, I think he is a pretty conservative president, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I am not convinced that even if he wants to, that he's going to be able to keep the border open, or that Brazil will keep the border open. Again, I don't think that should happen. I don't think they should close the borders. But I think it's absolutely reasonable to say that could happen.
Actually, there is an instance of that. I flew into Panama City, was taking a taxi to the center of town, and taxi drivers began blocking the road. because they wanted the government to prohibit Uber because Uber was being run by Colombians, by Venezuelans, I'm sorry, by Venezuelans. So already these things that Venezuelans are taking jobs from us has been happening. I don't know what that will lead to. And David, also, you know, I had a question for you in the sense that you said that democracy is the solution. I think it is the solution, but we shouldn't underestimate the challenges of this. Whoever takes over, if there is a democratic election and the government that takes over, the challenges are going to be huge. What they will inherit is a mess like very few democratic governments have inherited.
You mean
Economic, yeah.
after restoring democracy?
Yes.
Well, I prefer to have those
Yeah,
challenges
yeah,
in
no,
democracy
I do.
than still having
Me
this
too,
mess
yeah.
that is in Venezuela. But the things that we're saying, Mónica and Patio, were really interesting. I would like to add a few things. Maybe some could agree and some disagree. I think Venezuelans should be treated as refugees. And this is maybe the controversial thing, but I think Venezuelans should be treated as refugees. And there is an argument, which is Declaración de Cartagena, Cartagena Declaration of 1984, which expands, amplifies, expands the concept of a refugee when it says they have to, I'm just not going to quote it exactly, when it says that someone flee the country or because he's a victim of human rights violation, restriction of liberties,
Persecution.
Insecurity. Well, those are check in Venezuela. I've been in the border 6 times in the last 5 months, and I have seen 3 things. I have heard 3 things from Venezuelans all the time, in Brazil, in Colombia, and also in Peru and Ecuador. First thing they tell you, I'm not fleeing the country because I want. I'm doing this because against my will. And I know there are some Venezuelans here, and I'm sure that if I ask if any Venezuelan here wanted to leave the country, they will tell me no. Second, Venezuelans want to go back to the country. I mean, this is something new for Venezuelans. I always say that the generation that was before me, before my generation, I think didn't say the most important thing. Venezuela was known because we exported oil and because we exported women to participate in Miss Universe. But we didn't say the most important thing, that Venezuela, when there was a lot of dictatorship in Latin America, when there was a lot of armed conflicts in Latin America, when there was a lot of civil wars in Latin America or hyperinflation in Latin America, Venezuela exported democracy, and Venezuela exported freedom, and Venezuela exported rule of law. And there were so many migrants from Chile, from Bolivia, from Ecuador, from Colombia, from Cuba, that went to Venezuela. In the 1960s, 7.5% of the Venezuelan population were migrants. Now 10% of the Venezuelan population are refugees. What a change. I just going back again of the 3 things that I'm saying when I heard in the border. So Venezuela wants to go back. And the third thing is that Venezuelans want to work. Venezuela wants to be entrepreneur. Venezuelans wants just to have an opportunity, if it's in Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, or Peru, just to have the chance that they have not had in Venezuela. So I think those opportunities needs to be given. I think even though I know there is a huge challenge for the countries that are receiving Venezuelans, there's no money, and for the Syrian crisis, the international community has given, and you can correct me, $30 billion. Venezuela's crisis is not even close to that on that thing. So I think with this crisis, there is an opportunity for Latin American countries to integrate millions of Venezuelans to work, to study, and to be productive. And those Venezuelans will be needed in the future to rebuild our country. And it will not be the first time. I mean, it has happened in other parts of the world, that you have a population that was displaced, and then they had the opportunity to go back and help to recover the economy. I know what I'm saying is it sounds easy, but I know it's very difficult. But it's an opportunity to integrate. But the first thing is that the Venezuelans should be treated as refugees. I mean, the migration that happened before 2014, where there are a lot of in Miami or Madrid or Panama City or even here in New York, there was like middle class that the first cause of migration was insecurity, that they had maybe the resources to take a plane and leave the country. That's not the migration that is happening right now. I mean, people are walking days, weeks, months from Caracas to Montevideo, from Caracas to Bucaramanga, from Caracas to Cali, to Ecuador. How desperate has to be a woman with a baby walking for weeks, hundreds of kilometers, sleeping on the street to do that? How desperate you have to be? That's because in Venezuelans you are having human rights violation and you're having these humanitarian crisis. So I just wanted to add that.
But I think there's, first of all, I do not see xenophobia as something that we should worry about in the short term as much. I do think Venezuelans and Colombians are very similar. We say chévere, we do a lot of things similarly, and also because the migration is a lot of Colombian Venezuelans. Recently, we talked about more than 60% of the migration being only Venezuelan. But again, there are a lot of similarities between the two nations. There is Cucuta was always fluid in terms of migration. As I said, the Cucuta people would wake up in the morning and instead of going to put gas in their cars in Colombia, they would go to Venezuela and come back. Or they would have pimpineros, or all this illegal economy for the frontier because of subsidies, because of control of prices, is very difficult to handle. And Colombia has taken, Colombians in the frontier have taken advantage of that, as well as Venezuelans have taken advantage of that in the past. I would say, though, that the political role of Chavez and now Maduro in the region has had an immense impact. And I would say that Bolsonaro or even Duque, the discourse of domestic politics regarding Venezuela, we cover Venezuela as it was domestic politics in Colombia. This is, Maduro says something and Colombia notices. And there is a discourse, of course, from the right in the region that says, we don't want to become Venezuela. We don't want to become Venezuela. Do you want to become Venezuela? There are even posts, campaign posts of Iván Duque saying, so we don't become Venezuela, right? So this is a very strategic relationship for Colombia, for Brazil. The problem of closing the border, the problem of going to OAS, and pronouncing and making international appearances is very difficult. For Colombia, with the relationship with FARC, this was an ongoing tension. Every time that Colombia says something or did something, we're going to bring the military to their border. Everybody's scared about this. Venezuela still has a lot of military power, and Colombia doesn't have the capacity to respond. So these diplomatic relationships, of course, generate a discourse that is oppositional. But I see it more, at least in the Colombian case, as a discourse rather than as an attitude of regular people. I see Colombians being having solidarity. Bogota is even making a census of how many Venezuelans are there. People are accepting this situation because the news from Venezuela that come to Colombia are so difficult that people are like, oh my God, what is going on in there, right? And so in a way, what Colombians do not understand is how does a regime that treats its people like this is able to continue in power? And this is the question for a lot of people, like, how can people live there? I mean, what is the other story? What is the equilibrium that keeps this regime together that is so bad on certain people, yet so good to other people that seems to be viable in the future? And I do think that xenophobia might be a fear. But I personally, I would say that I haven't seen. Of course, there's prejudice. But there's prejudice with paisas. There's prejudice with, you know, a los bogotanos. There's prejudice with everybody in Bogota, in Colombia. but I wouldn't see it something that.
Cultural proximity is not a remedy for, or it makes impossible xenophobia. I mean, there's a lot of violence against migrants from Zimbabwe, from in South Africa. You know, I mean,
you know more than that. You're the expert.
No, I'm saying that, but I think no. I think you're right. And Colombia has an extra thing that may impede xenophobia, which is this memory that Colombians used to migrate, right, to Venezuela, that there were 2 million Colombians, so they welcome us when we needed. Now there is that.
We needed more visas than any nationality in the world to travel. We are used to being mistreated in every single nation. When you go to Mexico and you're Colombian, it's like, you know, sin number one.
No, but...
And what I'm trying to say is that Colombians understand situations.
No, but particularly with Venezuela, that Venezuela was the major receivers of Colombians, right? The largest...
From the photographs that I was showing, Marta, who had that stand and made that refuge, that shelter, she was half Venezuelan. I mean, there's not just that they are, some people are half Venezuelan. Or Ipanisa, the photographer that risked his own life to make those photographs, his parents were Colombian and he grew up in Venezuela, but he has brothers and sisters in Colombia. So in the case of Colombia and Venezuela, we are very mixed. It's not so much, the border is more imaginary. At one point we were Gran Colombia, we were one country.
I mean,
Just regarding the xenophobia topic, in the regional perspective, I know Colombia has done a great effort. I mean, 1.1 million Venezuelans are in Colombia registered. We probably are way more than that. I agree that the xenophobia cases are not that big. Have been the minority, are exceptional, are can I say something in Spanish? Está focalizado. I mean, it's been focalized, very located, but we cannot permit that monster to grow. So any action, any policy against xenophobia, we have to implement it. Because, as I said at the beginning, if Maduro is able to keep in power, you're going to have more people fleeing. And the more people flee, the more probability you have the more probability of xenophobia acts. So, I think this is something that shouldn't be a responsibility only for national governments. I think here is where mayors and governors and civil society play a key role. The local governments, the regional governments, civil society, NGOs, foundations, international agencies, the different churches to promote campaigns and actions against xenophobia, against discrimination it's really important. So once again, I think I agree with the professor. It's something that is exceptional, that is not happening everywhere. We have some cases, especially in the Caribbean. Our things are going on in Aruba, Curacao. Also, things are going on in Trinidad and Tobago. There were some things that happened in Peru or Brazil. But having said that, it is important that we do not permit to this thing get bigger. So some actions to stop it, because when something like that happens, I mean, everyone knows. When that thing happened in Brazil, that the tent was on, you know, were on fire in Brazil. I mean, it was a worldwide news. I mean, and so we have to work on that,
diligent,
and
yeah.
we're promoting that from the OES.
I think we can open it to the public if you have some questions and comments. Oh, there's a lot of interesting.
I have to apologize, but I have to leave
Alejandro,
in 5 minutes.
could you give me hand? Elena, Alejandro. Ah, okay. And then Elena.
Yeah, okay. Hi. Thank you for this excellent panel and information. My name is Rosa Bramble. Soy venezolana, and I also teach here at Columbia School of Social Work around trauma of immigrants and refugees. And I think my question, I have a question and comments, is that what would be the steps so that Venezuelans are in fact seen as refugees? Because I think that once that language and rhetoric changes, that's really going to allow for funds and whatever we need to do in South America or in Latin America or even in the world to respond to what's happening in Venezuela. So I'm curious to know what would be the steps. I mean, even at the UN, apparently there's not the response that we need. So that was one question. And in terms of a comment, I think that when we talk about what's happening in the borders, there's high crime, but there's also gender-based violence. So if we can include in these conversations the increase of human trafficking. So it's not only drugs that are being transferred, but also humans, right? And how so many women are being succumbed to human trafficking. And we know that when there is a war, although this is not a war with weapons, that victims usually are women and children, and how we can address that. Here in New York, I also provide services to Venezuelans. I'm the founder of Borders of Hope, Fronteras de Esperanza. It's been around for a number of years, working with different vulnerable groups. And in Columbia, at Columbia School of Social Work, we're helping students write psychosocial evaluations to help Venezuelans seeking asylum. And so we're also starting support groups and therapy groups. Because we believe that as refugees, there's so much trauma that comes along in terms of a refugee status, right? The trauma, there's hypervigilance, there's depression and anxiety, isolation, and that's part of what we're trying to, address. Thank you.
We can take a couple. So to answer your, at least the first question, and then maybe the second as well, I'm not holding my breath. Who and what is defined as a refugee is extremely political. The Venezuelan government, I'm sure David can talk about this, I don't think will ever acknowledge that there is a refugee or migration crisis of any kind, certainly not a humanitarian crisis. And as long as they have Russia and China on the Security Council, UNHCR does not have the political ability to make that call. And so I would be pleased but shocked if this was ever defined as a refugee crisis. I agree with David. I think Venezuelans are refugees. They're just as much refugees as Syrians, and it should be a blanket term that is applied to all of them. And I generally try to use that term, but politically, it's just, I don't think it's gonna happen. And certainly to your second question about trafficking and gender-based violence, we work with a lot of women, women and children in our centers in Cucuta and other cities to make sure that that's not something that they end up getting caught up in. I know that prostitution of Venezuelan women is significantly higher now in border communities and Colombia than it has been. And that's one of the reasons why we prioritize women at our centers. And we do a lot of psychological assistance as well. We bring in psychologists to speak with people. One of the most incredible experiences I had. I'm certainly not a psychologist, but one of our centers in, I believe it was Arica, Tacna, which is southern Peru, right on the border with Chile. Myself and our executive director sat down to interview a couple of people, Venezuelans, and asked them, why are you here? How did you get here? Why did you choose to leave? And we talked with a couple, and then we spent like the next 2 hours, and people just lined up because all they wanted to do was talk. I didn't need to say anything. I couldn't. I don't really speak Spanish, so. But I could understand. Yeah, I could understand. But that didn't matter. They just needed someone to listen to them. And so we do that, and we try to do that. So I hope maybe that alleviates a little bit of the concern, but I mean, you're right. There needs to be more of that, but we do try.
No, it's just going to add that, at least from the OES, we're going to make our biggest effort to get a consensus in the region that Venezuelans need to be treated as a refugee. We're working on a report that will be published by next year, in the first 3 months of next year, and then hopefully that report could be discussed at the Permanent Council, and in the Permanent Council hopefully we can have an agreement, a resolution, and we're working on obviously with evidence, with evidences that the countries, that the member states of the OES should agree that Venezuelans should be treated as a refugee. So if we achieve that, it will be a huge, I think, a very important thing for Venezuelan migrants.
I think that will help a lot the actual migrants, but that wouldn't bring resources from the United Nations, right? Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, it will be a huge step, and it will increase. It will
Pressure.
It will put pressure on the UN, on the other agencies, on the financial, on the multilaterals to give more money to this crisis. I mean.
She wants to say something from the UN perspective.
A quick, from the UN perspective, can you share your?
I think there was a very big change that happened today, and that for the first time ever, the Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs included Venezuela in its annual appeal. So they have recognized that there's a humanitarian crisis. That does not make it a refugee crisis, but they've only asked for $780 million for Venezuela. So I just thought I would add that since we were talking about resources for the Venezuelan crisis. Something is better than nothing, but still it's not enough.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for being here. My name is Eugenia Hernandez. I'm originally from Caracas, Venezuela, born and raised there, and graduated from high school and then doing my undergrad here at Columbia University. My question is directed to you, Smolansky. You were saying that the best way to, have our country back is to reestablish democracy. And this is a very complex question, but it's the one that when I'm talking with my friends or with people that don't know about the situation ask me more often, and that's where I'm out of words. How will we reestablish democracy? Or what are the first steps we should be doing? Or in your opinion, what is the first steps that will happen in order to reestablish democracy in our country? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to become too political here, Patrick.
It's okay.
This is from a very personal opinion. I think the next weeks in Venezuela are very critical because Maduro's term formally ends on January 10th, even though he robbed the elections in 2013. And there is something really weird in this dictatorship that the parliament is run by the opposition. When you see that normally dictatorships control everything, including the parliament. But in Venezuela, parliament is run by the opposition. So I think you need to work on different angles here. The first angle is that once Maduro ends its term on January 10th, the National Assembly could assume government functions. It's legal. It could be. It is legal. It is constitutional. It could have the support of the civil society, and it could have the support of the international community. So this is something really, really important, that the National Assembly could have functions of government from January 11th. But then you need key actors for that happen. No? The first actor is the civil society. You need people in Venezuela and also the diaspora being organized and being supporting that institution. In Venezuela started last week a Congreso de Venezuela Libre, Congress of Freedom Venezuela. It was it started in every state, then it became national, and a lot of people participated. And I know, I'm really aware that we cannot have the protests that we had last year, 120 consecutive days of protest. But having said that, I mean, in Venezuela, you're having daily protests. Sorry, you're having 25 daily protests. So I think right now, it's not the quantity of people participating in the protests, are the quality of the protest. I mean, I think Maduro is more afraid to have 200 people 4 blocks away from his palace than having 10,000 people in a motorway, and we were protesting last year, but kilometers far from the palace. Then you need international community. As we speak, 46 countries did not recognize Maduro after the fraud in May 20th. 46 countries. That could go to maybe 50 by January. There are some countries in South America, like Ecuador, for example, that it is important to not recognize Maduro in January 10th. They didn't say anything in May. They are changing its position. Also, countries in the Caribbean or even in Africa, it is important to be part of those 46. The third key actor, or the fourth, if you count the National Assembly, which is the most important, the most complicated, and some people don't want to talk about it, but I would love to talk about it, is the armed forces. I mean, you need institutional armed forces. So just to understand the context of the armed forces in Venezuela, Venezuela has 2,000 generals. That's more than the whole NATO. Venezuela has more generals than the whole NATO, which is the biggest military treaty in the world, where you have UK, France, the US, Canada, etc. But we have more generals than all of that. Those generals are the ones who protect Maduro. Those generals are the ones who have the privilege on the economy and in the politics. A lot of those generals are allegedly linked to those criminal activities and those illicit activities. But the middle-range officials and low-range officials are suffering from the same problem as any Venezuelan. Lack of food, lack of medicine, insecurity. I've seen so many soldiers and police that have deflected in the border. It is incredible. They have 1 day free on the month, and they just leave. In the last year, 5 military and police movements have been dismantled by the regime. But what it says that is there are huge disagreement inside the armed forces. Almost 50% of the political prisoners are soldiers at the moment, who have been tortured, who have been isolated. So is there a way that, obviously those strategies, I will not say it here, to articulate an institutional movement of the armed forces where they have to obey the law and the constitution. They don't have to be part of the opposition. They don't have to protect a leader of the opposition. They need to protect. What the Venezuelan constitution says is that the armed forces are to protect the territory and its citizens. And if they do that, if they're able to articulate that, in my opinion, the transition in Venezuela starts. So it's very difficult because we're facing a criminal state, obviously. But I think the next weeks are critical, and if we are able to achieve all of these things that I have told you, civil society, international community, keep the parliament now with function of the government and the armed forces, maybe we can start transition in Venezuela, we can reestablish democracy, we can have free and fair elections, we can release the political prisoners, and hopefully the rebuilding of the country starts.
Yes, good afternoon. Well, thank you for being here. My name is Michelle Mesa, and I'm a student in Columbia University. I'm Peruvian, and I'm an activist there. So I have a question and a comment. The question is, what would an international or regional response need to have? Because a response can range from a declaration to an intervention, right? So what are the minimum components that you think would be critical for this response to start moving towards a solution in Venezuela? And the comment is that, yes, it is true, there are many politicians, and this has happened in Peru as well, that they do nasty politics and they use the argument of Venezuelans and they criminalize Venezuelans to polarize politics and to gain political outcomes from there. But there is also an active civil society that have come against these politicians, that have punished these politicians through elections, and that absolutely welcome Venezuelans as we would welcome any other brother or sister of the region, because this can happen in any country. Now it's Venezuela, but tomorrow can be any other country. So Venezuelans are more than welcome in Peru. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And as a Venezuelan, we have to be very grateful with all the Peruvian that have received us. There are 500,000 Venezuelans right now in Peru. Peru, I think, is in the third country with most Venezuelans after Colombia and the U.S. So, and I know there were some local elections in Peru that were a candidate that used the Venezuelan crisis to polarize, and because of the civil society, he lost. He was running for the mayor of Lima, right? So the regional response, maybe Patrick could talk on the humanitarian side. On the political side, I mean, there are many things that could be done. I mean, you could do more individual sanctions from Europe, Canada, United States, but the most important, sanctions from Latin America. I know the Colombian parliament is working on a list of sanctions, individual sanctions against officials from the regime that have been involved in human rights violation, illicit activities, corruption, money laundering. So hopefully, if Colombia do that in the near future, Panama has already done it, other Latin American countries do the same. And also they need to restrict the transit of those high officials on the region, because it's incredible. If Diosdado Cabello or Jorge Rodriguez want to take a plane and go to Mexico, Argentina, they could do. They could do. So that shouldn't be allowed. That shouldn't be permitted. We need to understand that Venezuela has become geopolitical piece on the game. Maduro is right now in Moscow. He had a meeting earlier with Vladimir Putin. 3 days ago, Erdogan from Turkey went to Caracas. So, I mean, also the dictatorships are cooperating between them. So the Democrat governments also, we need to get together. But when I say to get together, not only the governments, but also, I love what you say, civil society. I mean, this is really important, because I think in an era where you have Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all this technology and a smartphone, what is the international community? It's not only the governments. It is also the civil society. It is also influencers, celebrities, athletes that could do something. I mean, Angelina Jolie went to Peru, and I think that was more known than any president that visited the border. But those are the things that are important sometimes to change things. So the regional response on politically talking is like that. Maybe some ambassadors need to be taken out from Caracas. And also the money that is going to Venezuela after January 10th, if you have the parliament, that should change. So we're working on that.
from a humanitarian standpoint, it begins and ends with money. You know, the people that we are serving every day can't eat paper, they can't eat words. We need money to pay for the meals to feed them. Same for vaccinations, same for beds, all these things. And again, as I've said tonight, up to this point, there have been shows of solidarity, and I think the U.S. has donated about $100 million through the State Department and USAID, but that is not even close. It's like like a drop in the bucket is being too generous. And so I don't want to sound like I'm saying that it's bad that they're donating $100 million, but we need to be talking in the billions of dollars from both the United States, the European Union, and other countries that have those kinds of resources. I don't think we can fairly expect Latin American countries, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, to fund most or even all of this, or some or even most of this themselves. Because Colombia, for example, has to also deal with FARC. I mean, they were in a civil war up until about 2 years ago, and now all of a sudden, you know, surprise, you have to pay for all of these people to be reintegrated, thousands of FARC fighters. And at the same time, you need to spend a couple $2 billion integrating Venezuelans too. So any regional response on the humanitarian side has to be money, and has to be real money, not the kind of nice, you know, send a thank you note kind of money, real money. And that money needs to get to be honest, organizations like ours, organizations that are actually working on the ground every day with people, because right now, even the money that is being donated and is being given from government to government is not getting to us. It's not getting to our grassroots partners. It's not, you know, it just stays, honestly, I don't even know where it goes. So their hearts are in the right place. Their hearts are in the right place. And that money does do good things. So I don't want to come off as being all that negative, but we have to do a lot better.
My name is Carlos Salamanca. I am Colombian, and I would like to indicate some point that I think is very important. Colombia is a country in crisis too. If you see the economy in Colombia, we depend on demand. You see Venezuela, the same. The economy depends on demand. What happened with education in Colombia? We had the huge movement, student government, defending the public university right now. What happened with the corruption? I don't know if you are familiar with what happened in Colombia with the corruption. I don't know if they compete who is the winner, in Venezuela or in Colombia. I really don't care. You know, the right wing, the left wing, whatever it is, the government is the government. The corruption is horrible. The destruction of the economy in Colombia is terrible. The 7% of the population work in the streets, selling candy in the semaphores, etc., in every single city in Colombia. And it's very important to three things in why the people love the Venezuelan when they come into our country. One, we have 6 million people displacement internally after 50 years of internal conflict arm. That's why people understand what happened in the small town. People come to the middle cities and the big cities. So they are accustomed to see people who are not in the city. They are not from there. And two, the Colombian, many common people have family members in Venezuela for many years. Part of my family, my older sister, lived in Venezuela for maybe 15 years. So we know Venezuela. Even the Venezuela don't love too much the Colombian. I know it's a tradition from the history. And the last thing is that even that situation, we say welcome to the Venezuelans in Colombia. The government, what the government are open the frontier with Venezuelans because they support the right-wing opposition in Venezuela, and it's great. They cannot say right now, oh no, now I don't like the Venezuelans. We need to close. No, if you say that you are the opposition in Venezuela against the government in Venezuela, you need to allow the Venezuelans come. That's the situation, and that's why the government is open the door to the Venezuelans. So we have two factors. The common people, we love the people in Venezuela for the two reasons I mentioned to you. And the government opened the door for the Venezuelans because they can to say, we love the opposition, and now we close the door. That's not make sense. That's the situation. In the short term, we are welcoming the Venezuelans. I am afraid what's going on in the middle term or the long term, because the situation increased the crisis in Colombia. The economic situation, the unemployment, the economy informal, everything is terrible in Colombia too. So I don't know how much the Colombia is able to absorb like 2 million Venezuelans. 1 million go to Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, I don't know the exact numbers. But that's the situation that concerns the Colombians, is what's going on in the middle term and the long term. That's the situation. Well, that's I want to say, to mention this situation because no Jews mentioned those situations. And it's very important for me that Colombian, and even though that situation of crisis, we welcome the Venezuelans. That's very important for us to say welcome all the time. If they need to stay in Colombia, stay in Venezuela, in Colombia. Good, because they are Venezuelan, they received to us for 50 years over there, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, they went there. So why not you are coming to our country? We cannot say no. We need to accept that situation. Thank you.
Okay. One more call. We're exploiting our guest here. One more question, okay. You decide.
I think two or three.
Two, okay, two.
Two or three.
We can, three even. I mean, they're being generous.
Okay,
We can take all the questions and we answer.
Oh, yeah, okay.
okay, I'm Vanessa Jimenez, Venezuela. I would like to talk about the xenophobia because it's very important to attack that. I think that one of the most countries that have to focus is in Colombia because the majority people that walk or they're going to Colombia, they across the border. I have information that every week I talk with a friend that she crossed the border every week. She told me that it's very important to focus in the camps of the ACNUR because some people, majority people want to work, yes? They have ideas to do a business or maybe, or some people, they have some money before to across the border, or yes, they want to do something. They want to do something, not only for part of the economy, informal economy. So they need orientation. So I would like to know. I would like to ask too about this. For Smolansky, please. I asked you the last week, but I think that you have the answer. So, how to get the cooperation of those regions, countries receiving the exodus, being that those states have no established economics. It's very important to know because people need the documents, people need orientation, people need education. So it's very important to know that. And what are the regions, countries doing to get an agreement and get a democracy restitution, which will be a solution to the human crisis, okay? Thank you.
Let's take two more and make questions brief. And there is that lady with the red hair behind. She's behind.
I have a couple of questions, but first, I do want to talk a little bit about the xenophobia. I know there's been a lot of comments. I would recommend everyone who can speak Spanish to listen to Radio Ambulante, whose latest episode deals with Venezuelans specifically going to Peru and Panama. And they do mention specific cases where they faced xenophobia and bad response. And I'm not saying that that's a majority of countries, and I'm not saying that's a majority of people. And I do know there's a lot of people in Peru, for example, who are resisting this situation. And I also understand the causes of these. It's not easy to accept millions of people out of nowhere. But I do think we should keep it always in mind, and listening to these stories helps us to see how it happens in reality and how people who are there actually feel it. My questions are a little different. they're twofold. The first is, do you guys, and specifically David, do you have the confidence in, and I know you were part of it, but do you have a confidence in the leadership of the opposition to take on the challenge of what's coming in the next few weeks? I do know that the government has been extremely oppressive, and that a lot of the people have sacrificed so much to, especially the leader of Voluntad Popular, Leopoldo, who has been in prison for years and is now, his liberty has been taken away for such a long time. But they have not responded in several moments when it has been key. And in this moment where it's now very key, and they seem to be doing a lot of organization with the Frente Amplio, and they've established the congresos, are they ready to set one leader, to choose him when the assembly takes a new year, and then to impulse that person to become the de facto leader of the country on the 10th, and to actually try and defend it? I know they'll need much more support than just the opposition itself, but are they ready for that? And the second question is for us who are outside the country. I'm not a refugee. I came here to study, and I've stayed, and I wish to go back to my country, but I haven't been able to. But still, I'm a privileged person. But what can we do to really help? First, and this goes to everyone here, where can we donate that will make the most impact? Because that's, I think, an important thing. There are a lot of organizations that help Venezuela, but where can we, like an actual place where we can go and donate? And then more importantly, how can we become more involved? The Frente Amplio was doing the congresos in el exterior, in the exterior, and I would love to participate at that. I've tried putting up my name, but I haven't received any answer from them. I don't know if you have any more information on that, because donating is one part, but we also want to feel as part of doing something that actually brings about a difference in the country, which we know the political change is the first and most important thing that has to happen.
Hi, my name is Catherine. I am a Venezuela student here at Columbia, and I wanted to make a comment about the economic situation of the country. Professor Moya was saying that it will be such a huge undertaking for the next administration in the country to reinstitute democracy and stability in the country. But the reality is that the current administration has made everything that economics says not to do. The people who have been in charge of the Ministry of Economics and the central bank are not economists, and they have said things as inflation doesn't exist. So really, for this economic situation especially to be fixed, it will be much quicker than what people think. When you hear 1 million% inflation, that sounds very much and unimaginable for most people around the world. But we have seen examples in other countries, such as Bolivia, who went 1 year from 60,000% inflation to the next year, 9% inflation. So the reality is that the people in the government have made everything possible to destroy the economy.
That's interesting. And there was some people were complaining about this.
Hello.
Okay.
My name is Alejandro O'Neill. I am an MPA student at CIPA. I am from Colombia. I have a couple of comments and specific questions, especially to the representative of the Scalabrini. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce that. In terms of humanitarian relief, right now the Colombian government has approved a documento COMPES. I don't know if you're aware of that. This documento COMPES, it's a political framework to dictaminates what the government institutions must do in a specific issue in Colombia. This documento COMPES states, first of all, that Venezuelans incoming the country will be issued special permits for work so they can integrate in a certain way the economy. And we've been issuing these permissions for about 2 years now. I am also aware that these permissions are also being issued by the Chilean government and the Peruvian government. So I think that the political will of attending the migration crisis that there is in our region, there is a lot of steps that we have taken to take care of the humanitarian situation, not only regarding the typical or the traditional humanitarian aid actors. Also, I would like to comment that the UNHCR, along with many other UN agencies, have established in Colombia a special cluster called the Venezuela Situation Cluster for about 2 years now, that has been gathering data on humanitarian issues, on maybe funding possibilities in order to guide international aid into our countries to help to the solution of the humanitarian crisis. I would like to know if Scalabrini or any other, even the Servicio de Refugiados or Consejo Noruego de Refugiados who are working in the field are aware of these initiatives that come from the Lima Declaration, that come from the Quito Declaration from last year, and that have deployed a lot of efforts in order to help in any way possible. Of course, I'm not undermining the crisis and the fact that the Venezuelans are suffering in our countries, and we are, again, welcome to come. But I guess the humanitarian response in our region has been, first of all, very effective in terms of trying to use the governments as platforms to understand what's happening in terms of migration, not of refuge, but of migration. And second, to guide some money into helping these people, especially through the Colombian government. So I just wanted to mention this and clarify a little bit.
Okay, so we can.
Go ahead. Oh, you want me to start with the last? Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as I was kind of trying to say earlier, but maybe not that clearly, there are certainly groups and organizations that are responding financially to the crisis, and I don't want to downplay what they're doing. UNHCR, gives us some funding, although it's very minimal. The World Food Program, for example, has been a huge partner in Cucuta for us. My point, though, is that based on the resources that they have and their size, they're not doing close to enough. And I mean, I can tell you that our teams on the ground are aware of all of these things, and not always, but a lot of times groups of people get together with their hearts in the right place and they don't really end up doing anything. Declarations are great. New, calls for action are great. But as I said before, the people that we serve can't eat those things. And unfortunately, there have been a lot of people saying a lot of things, talking about a lot of action that's never happened. Again, there are some things happening. There is some funding. The UNHCR is funding our work. IOM is funding our work in certain places. So I'm not saying that they're the bad guys, but what I am saying is, from the outside, it may look like a lot is happening and all these organizations are building big coalitions, but I can tell you from experience and from being on the ground and talking with our folks, it's not translating yet. I wish it was, but.
Okay, regarding the other two questions that were two people with 2 questions each, 4 questions. I think that what your question about, I think you said the second question was to restore democracy and regional response to democracy and humanitarian crisis. Well, I explained the route that I think needs to be done on the next weeks, and that we're working on it. And Patrick has explained the regional response for the humanitarian crisis. You can correct me, Patrick, but we have found in the OES there are very important areas that need to be addressed for the Venezuelan migrants and refugees: food, healthcare, education, capacity building, legal assistance, security. I'm missing 2, but those are just these 6 areas are very infrastructure, of course, shelters, and are the things that need to be done and need to be implemented, and the governments needs to give to Venezuelans their migration status. That's why I think to promote the Venezuelans as refugees through the Declaración de Cartagena, doing through the OES, at least will increase the pressure, and hopefully the countries will be agree on that, but at least I'm going to work on that on the report. Your first question was about the economy, or did I respond on the xenophobia? Well, as I said, I mean, I think it's fault. I mean, it's not the majority of acts are no xenophobia. I think are very well located, and we cannot permit that monster to grow. So we need actions. We need actions against xenophobia, discrimination, and as I said, this is something that is not only in the national governments, but I think it's a huge opportunity for governors, mayors, and civil society to promote campaigns and actions against xenophobia. On the other two questions, the role of the diaspora, that's a very good one, because for us this is something new, and I've been asked this so many times. I think the diaspora, especially in a city like New York, could do a lot of advocacy on the international community. You have here the United Nations, where the Venezuelan crisis has to be on the discussion all the time, and those advocacy will permit to increase the pressure for the international community. Also initiatives like the Congreso Venezuela Libre, that is, it will be, we're under that discussion as well, that is, it will be organized on different cities in the world. Of course, New York is one of the most important. There has been activities here. You have behind a very active person here in New York. Eric Rosso, for example, was one of the organizers of the protests on behalf of the United Nations, where Ambassador Nikki Haley went. So those are the things that are, I mean, you cannot imagine. I had the opportunity to talk to Ambassador Haley, and you cannot imagine the impact when she went and stayed for a few minutes with Venezuelan protesters in that moment. I talked to her before the protest, and I talked to her after the protest, and those are also the things that the diaspora could do. I know it's difficult because everyone is working, are studying, there are so many things that has to be done, but they're just giving examples of that. And if the opposition is ready, I think we are. We've been working the last months on a recovery plan for the country, a transition plan, but also a public policy plan that we've been discussing: economy, oil, mining, security, education, defense, health, infrastructure. Obviously, I will not lie, there are some disagreements inside the opposition, but it's something that, in my opinion, is not a problem. I think here we need to have the ones who want to get rid of the dictatorship. The ones who don't want to get rid of the dictatorship, I mean, se van a quedar en el camino, you know?
They're going to be left on this side.
They're going to be left on the side. Thank you so much for the translation. Sorry about my English. As Celia Cruz used to say, my English is not very good looking, so neither mine. So, and there are great leaders. Leopoldo López, as you said, he's been in jail for almost 5 years. Antonio Ledesma is in exile. Maria Corina Machado is doing also a very important work there. And they are united in this route. But also, I think there is an opportunity for young leaders to get more involved in politics, to get more involved in public servant, and to get more responsibilities. That's what I have learned. I mean, I started in politics 10 years ago, with 20 years old, being in the student movement. And what I have learned on these years is that if you don't get involved, probably the bad ones are the ones who will get involved. So also I think it's an opportunity now, and you don't have to be in Venezuela, you can do it from the diaspora, that the new generations become involved in politics. And I say this because when I participated last year in the protest, and sometimes I don't talk this too much. I had to bury 5 of the students that were killed last year. And when I had this terrible episode of burying someone that was 22 years old, someone that was just 18 years old, and they were born with Chavez, and they haven't seen anything different, and they were fighting for democracy, freedom, human rights. They were fighting for things that our generation don't know what it is. I mean, I heard so many times, oh, Venezuela was a country of plenty of opportunities, el está barato, dame dos. I mean, so many migrants came to Venezuela. I have never seen that. You haven't seen that. And the people are younger and us haven't seen that. But to fight through non-violent ways to conquer something that you have even, that you don't know, that you have not enjoyed, I think is that the most beautiful thing that this generation has. And I would like to end this panel, and once again, thank you so much for inviting me. That I do admire every Venezuelan that has emigrate. It's difficult to emigrate. It's difficult sometimes to hear or to read in the social media that you were cowards, that it's easy to live outside, that's fine, that you are in New York or everything. And let me say this in Spanish. Yo admiro mucho a todos los venezolanos que han tenido que emigrar y los respeto enormemente. Yo soy de una familia de emigrantes, mis abuelos, mi papá, y ahora a mí nos ha tocado salir de regímenes comunistas. Y cuando a veces leo en las redes sociales o escucho personas que dicen que la vida afuera es sabrosa, que es tranquila, que tú puedes decir eso porque estás en la comunidad de Nueva York y Miami, no saben lo que es estar separado de la familia, no saben lo que es estar separado de las raíces, no saben lo que es estar lejos de las calles donde nos criamos, no saben lo que es estar lejos de la arepa que te pueda preparar tu abuela o de la yaca que en esta época te pueda preparar tu madre, lo que es estar hasta las 4 de la mañana lavando platos en un restaurante para poder vivir, lo que es estar haciendo Uber de lunes a lunes, 12 horas cada día para poder vivir, lo que es estar reuniendo una plata 6 meses para poder traerte a tu familia y al menos verla una vez al año, y lo que es tratarte de adaptar a una cultura completamente ajena a la nuestra por idioma, etcétera, y que veamos venezolanos aquí que llegaron durmiendo en un sofá en una casa prestada, que llegaron, eso, como estoy diciendo, haciendo Uber 14 horas al día o trabajando hasta las 6 de la mañana en un local, y que hoy los veas estudiando en universidades como la de Columbia, que tú los veas hoy consiguiendo trabajo en importantes empresas, que tú lo veas hoy todavía con la vocación de servir por Venezuela. Eso es lo que a mí me da esperanza de que este país se va a recuperar, de que este país tiene una reserva moral gigante y que todos ustedes que han emigrado van a ser necesarios para reconstruir a Venezuela. Así que Dios los bendiga, and God bless every Venezuelan.